Great to be here. I want to start just by acknowledging and honoring the First Nations people who were sustained by this land prior to European colonization and genocide. I'm going to talk a little bit about women and women's struggles in the context of capitalism. In the current crisis of globalized capitalism, women around the world are facing increased oppression and attacks. We know that capitalism is a racist, imperialist, and misogynistic system that exploits women, colonizes, occupies, and displaces people of color, and destroys the diversity of life on the planet. This is clear because when we look at many of the struggles in which women around the world are engaged in, we can easily trace them back to their capitalist roots. Globalization, or globalized capitalism rather, which is manifested through imperialist expansion, must be fought and ultimately destroyed through a socialist revolution that acknowledges and overcomes women's oppression and that recognizes women's contributions and leaderships in the struggle. Under capitalism and patriarchy, women's historic status as property has resulted from the division of society into exploited and exploiting classes. So capitalism has really reinforced this idea that women can be reduced to resources for reproduction, and this has completely devalued women's worth both inside and outside of the home. So this, in conjunction with other social justices that result from capitalism, has translated into significant threats for women's health and well-being, particularly for Indigenous women, women of color, immigrant and refugee women, Muslim women, working class and poor women, queer and transgender women, disabled women, young women and girls, old women, and certainly women who identify with more than one of these categories. So women around the world face various forms of violence and injustice on a daily basis, whether it's economic violence, sexual and domestic violence, attacks on reproductive autonomy, food sovereignty, or ecological destruction. So many of the injustices that come about as a result of the capitalist system really affect women adversely and uniquely. And although these injustices seem sort of abstract at their structural levels, they have very real and concrete implications for women's lives. So this is true both in the United States and in an international context. In terms of capitalism, going beyond the scope of the United States, we've seen that globalization is having really horrible effects on women around the world, especially women workers. Because women have been so devalued, their work has been so devalued, they're especially underpaid and especially exploited in many workplaces, especially when they're employed in transnational corporations in the global south. One example of this is in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, where hundreds and maybe even thousands of women have been tortured and mutilated and murdered going to and returning from work in these factories called maquiladoras, which are owned by typically American companies. In these factories, the companies who employ them offer little or no protection to the women. So basically, you're left with the choice to either go to work and face being assaulted or abused or harassed or even murdered, or to not work and suffer from the poverty that NAFTA has inflicted upon Mexico. So with this current crisis in capitalism, what we've been talking about is that capitalism is really reaching its limits here, and this is intensifying the attacks on people who are already oppressed. So it's not going to be the bankers and the politicians who suffer as a result of this, and we already know it's the workers and poor people, women, people of color who are suffering. You know, bankers are losing their home or worrying about how they're going to provide food to their families or health care or things like that, yet people all over the world are being displaced from their homes and losing their jobs and suffering from cuts in education and health care as a result of capitalist greed. So, sorry, just one second. So in the United States, this is evident in the foreclosure crisis, which is happening all over the U.S., but it's especially devastating the city of Detroit. And this displacement is also happening not just from the foreclosure crisis, but also from gentrification and environmental disasters. You can just look at New Orleans and the rest of the Gulf Coast for an example of that. Also, Indigenous women in the United States face unbelievably high rates of domestic violence, rape, suicide, substance abuse. All of these things are inextricably linked to the poverty among First Nations people. So in an international context, there are a lot of different crises that are being fueled by capitalism that are affecting women. I have just a few examples. For example, in Haiti, millions of people have been killed and displaced as a result of the earthquake that took place almost a year ago. And despite this being seen as like a natural disaster, it's the legacy of colonialism and imperialism that's really intensifying the crisis by failing to provide people with food and water and shelter. And Haitian women in particular, who have already been traumatized by losing their homes and their families, face the additional threat of sexual violence in the tent camps that offer very little security. And on top of this, Haiti is now facing this worsening cholera epidemic that's already infected like 1,000 people in the past week and a half. And all these people are still without housing. A similar thing is happening in Pakistan, where millions of people have been killed and displaced from the climate change-induced flood catastrophe that happened several months ago. It put almost 20% of the country underwater, and women are especially at risk in this situation. They face sexual violence, they face starvation and disease, and rather than providing aid to human beings who are in need, Obama's imperialist war machine has continued with these drone strikes on the region rather than helping out the people of Pakistan who are in need. So militarism and imperialism as tools of capitalism have very negative consequences for women around the world, particularly women in occupied countries in the Middle East like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine. Militarism is really an example of glorifying and demonstrating of violent masculinity and aggression, and it's very much misogynistic and homophobic. And this is obvious when we see the effects that war has on women, both in terms of the violences they face during conflicts and also the structural adjustment policies that they deal with that don't really address their needs after the conflicts have ended. So ultimately, we need to be conscious of the struggles that women are facing in the context of capitalism, imperialism, and militarism. We have to recognize how the well-being of women is so closely linked to the struggle for economic, environmental justice, and anti-imperialism. We must fight for a socialist revolution and align ourselves with the resistance and militancy that women around the world are engaged in. Because women who are resisting these injustices are facing a lot of oppression and persecution. For example, Sister Alam Mohsen, who she's being investigated by the FBI, facing possible federal charges because she decided to speak out against U.S. imperialism and militarism by pieing the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Racist anti-Arab repression and attack because she wanted to express solidarity with the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine. So we have to support and stand with women around the world who are resisting capitalism, misogyny, and imperialism, because we absolutely cannot build women's liberation without addressing occupation and militarism and racism. Solidarity is a must, so down with capitalism, build a workers' world.